Hello! In the previous videos, we discussed executing the test cases with different frameworks like Cypress or Playwright. This time, let's a little bit discuss about execution parameters. We can pass some arguments when executing our test cases. So I want to talk about what kind of parameters we can pass when writing our execution commands. So let's start with Cypress. So here I have a spec file which I'm just writing for some simple test scenarios. So I have a Google test file here, so let's use the same one. And starting from the config file, like normally after the Cypress is installed in our environment, we can see the config file like this one. I have another one I just created, let me delete for now. And yeah, this is the default one. So normally, if I execute my test with opening the Cypress runner, let's see. Of course, we have to type correctly. Okay, now I have the Cypress runner, and if I select the E2E test with the Electron browser, then I have the list of spec files, and yes, I can see all the spec files under the relevant folders. Even the list of spec files is defined in the config file. So if I want to change this configuration, of course I can just edit the config file, but instead I can create another config file, because sometimes I need two different configurations. In some tests I will use the one, and for the others I will use the other one. So let's try to do that. I will just copy this and just paste here with a different name. And here I want to see some other spec files, like I want all these. My Google test is somewhere like under playground folder. So let me pass the relevant path here, I plus playground, and with the extension TS. All right. So if I want to use this config file, the first parameter that I can pass to the execution command would be selecting the config file. For this, let me try to zoom in here. I will pass this key, which is the config file, and then I will select the relevant file I want to use. In this case, since I'm in the root folder now, I will just pass Cypress. If I select tab, I can already see the options I can use. So the one that I just created was this one, right? config2.ts. Now, when I again start my Cypress runner, yeah, this time I see only 3 test cases, because this is the folder that I define to detect all the spec files. So I have 3 of them, and I want to execute the Google test. So this is the first parameter that I can pass. Moving on, if I want to execute only Google test, but I have 3 different spec files, right? So I want to execute a specific spec file. So let's try to select this when I'm running my command. So for that, it would be another argument with spec key. So it should be something like this. And then I'll select my file, which would be something like, again, I can see all the options with tab option. Under Playground and Google Test. Yes. Cool. But when I execute this, something was wrong, right? Because the Cypress couldn't understand what I'm trying to do, because as we discussed before, there are two different modes in Cypress. The first one is open mode, which is starting the Cypress runner. And on the Cypress runner UI, I can already see all the list of spec files. So I can manually select the file that I want to execute. So there is no need for this spec key. So why or under what conditions can it be used? When I'm running in the run mode, right, which is without starting the Cypress runner. So normally, if I don't pass this, it will execute all the tests, found test or matched with my query under the relevant folder, and it will execute all of them in a sequence. But now, if I pass this, it will execute only the relevant spec file or only the relevant list of spec files. So let's see how it works. So this time I will use run mode instead of open mode. Let me change here. And yes, the execution started. It failed, but it doesn't matter. I think it's something related to the dependencies, but eventually the test executed. So this is already what I wanted to try, and this is a good feature. But I can even select a list of files, like matching a specific pattern. So I can even use wildcards. Like, let's try something like this. Or even like all the files under this folder, right? Under the specific folder, all the files matching this pattern. This time, we can already see Cypress found 3 tests. Those are the custom function, something like that, Google test and Playground test. So 3 tests match to the pattern that I passed. So this is another thing that I can do to select the test cases to be executed. And what else I can do? I can even select the browser, right? Because normally we didn't see any browser here at all. So if I want to see what is happening here, I can pass our next parameter, which is the headed, because normally the default option for run mode is the headless execution. If I want to see the browser itself, then I have to pass this headed key. Let's see what happens now. Now the execution starts and I can see the browser itself. It is very fast, so it just closed right away, but I could see the browser. And I can see I can select even the type of browser or which browser on which I will execute my test cases. So let's try to pass some browser here with the browser key, and then I will select, let's for example start with Chrome. Now I see it is opening the Chrome browser. Cool. What if I select Firefox? This time I can see the Firefox browser opens. Alright, so I can pass what kind of arguments, as we can see here. I can select the config file, I can pass the spec files that I want to execute, I can select the mode, which could be either headless or headed mode, and I can select the browser on which I will execute my test cases. Something else that I often use while developing the test code is using the custom environmental variables, because sometimes there are some conditional cases. For example, if I'm running test across any specific application, then I'm calling some kind of locators, and if the application under test is a different one, then maybe I'm calling another locators file. So for managing these kind of configurational variables, I'm defining some custom environmental variables. Let's see how we can do that. Again, let me open the config file that we just created. It was here, and here I already have some custom variables. So under env field, I can this is an object, so I can define several fields, like even a new one. This is, for example, my custom variable. So again, it can be a string, list, or even a Boolean variable. So let's define as just a string for the sake of simplicity. This is a sample custom variable value. All right, I just saved. And how I can use this is, let's just, maybe we can just print in the console just to see the value. Let's print it here. So now what we will use is reading the environmental variables from the Cypress framework. And what was my custom variable key? It was my custom variable. My custom variable. Let's see what happens here. So I don't have to select the browser anymore. Actually, let me just open the Cypress runner. So I don't want to pass the other arguments, just a config file. Now I have the Cypress runner. I select my browser and I select my test here. When I execute, I can already see the console here. So what is printed here is sample custom variable value. Was it the value that I passed here? Yes, it is. Cool. So I can already set some custom variables here. That's pretty cool already. But I can even further dynamically override this, or I can pass from the command line. So this would be one more argument along with all the others, like along with selecting the config file, spec files with using wildcards, the execution mode, and the browser. Now I will pass some custom variables. So actually, let's again start the run mode. But since it is the console print, so maybe it's better to run the open mode. So this is the last command that I write. So now what I will do is I will just pass the env keys to pass some custom variables. So my key is my customer, and my value is, normally the default value is sample custom var value, right? So let's set a new one, new custom variable value. When I execute in this way, I wanted to start the open mode, but I passed run, so let me change this. Of course, now I have to skip the selecting the spec files, right? Because the Cypress runner doesn't like this key. It will already provide all the list of spec files. So now I have it, and I can select the test that I want to run. It is here, execute, and I can see the value, which is passed to my command line arguments. So it is overriding the default value, which was defined here. So this is another pretty cool feature we can use in our automation environments. And I can pass even more than one. Let's try that as well. For example, if I pass another environmental variable, like the app is set to Townwork by default. Now I want to test Google. So let's see how I can use it. Just start the execution. And after I execute my test, I can see all the new variables that I pass to my execution command. Now let's try to do all these with Playwright, and this time I'll use the same file that I have. So let's try to execute this. Playwright test. And this is the first option I will pass to my execution command. So without any key, I will just pass my test file name, which is Google test.ts. No test found because I have to check my config file just under the root folder. It is here. So I don't see any test directory, so I have to add. As far as I start typing, it automatically completes with some options. So I will go with test directory, and in this case, it will be this IPL folder I'm using for just testing purposes. Let's try it again. Still no test found because when I type test, I realized some other options like test match, right? Because Playwright by default tries to find all the tests or all the spec files following a specific pattern, which is something like under any folder. Of course, should be inside codes. With like any file with spec and JavaScript or TypeScript extension, something like this. But I don't care about having a spec extension, so just JavaScript or TypeScript extension should be fine for me. And since I know my file is TypeScript, I can even go only with TypeScript. So this should be fine for me. Let's try. I saved my file and I again execute. Now the test is running, and actually it's just passed because there's nothing inside the test. It is quite fast, but I wanna see the browser as well. So I can pass the headed option to my execution command as well. This time I saw the browser started, but since it is very fast, it right away closed. But this is already another option I can pass to my execution command. Let's talk about the custom environmental variables as well. So I can define some custom variables under the metadata object in my config file. So let's pass some values here. So this is my key, and I'll set to some values. The value can be any boolean or string or any other type. So let's go with string because I will print to console. Okay. How I will leverage into my code is I will read from the config, right? Because I added to my config file. Metadata with the relevant key, which was my key, I guess. My key. All right. But config is not resolved, right? Because I didn't define anywhere because it is not a variable. It is just an import. So let me add the import statement from the playwright.config. But there's another notification which says object might be undefined. Yes, this is a valid concern, but since as of now I know it is defined, for now I'm just ignoring, but in general it's a valid concern. Let's see what happens now. I see the value that was set to my key. So in this way I can read the custom variables. But as similar to what we do in Cypress, I can pass from even the command line. So let me just set some variables here directly on the command line, like my custom key is my custom value. Let's execute in this way. But this time, if I execute as is, it will not write anything, right? Because, I mean, it will write again the same thing. But this time I'm not reading from config file, I'm reading from the console. So this time I have to use process object, and I will access to env attribute, and I will get the variable, and I know the key and value pair. In this case it was my custom key. Should be fine, let's see. Yes, now I see my custom value, which I passed in the command line, can be used inside the test code.